My name is Dan Rheault. I'm the head of strategy for appNovi, and I'm joined by the co-founder and chief solutions architect, Ethan Smart. Ethan, you there?
I am here, and it's good to be live and good to be recording this.
Wonderful. So, for those of you joining us today, today's conversation is about cybersecurity mesh architecture. It's not something that we sought to actually achieve or build to, right, Ethan?
No, it was really a matter of Joe and I, my co-founder, and you talking really about our stories, the problems that we had dealt with in our past, going and solving those problems, and really realizing how the both the philosophy of what we were building to solve, as well as in practice what we were building to solve, really became what encompasses cybersecurity mesh architecture.
And so here we are, and it's not as though we're freewheeling all of this. We will keep it pretty casual, but we do have an agenda for today's conversation.
Mm.
First, we're going to cover what cybersecurity mesh architecture is, disambiguate between the acronyms. I know I hate them. Most other people do too, right? CASM versus CSMA. What are they? How do they differentiate from one another? We want to talk about why cybersecurity mesh architecture is increasing in relevance today. We also want to provide some insight on how it's actually helping enterprises increase their security capacity and efficiency in operations. Now, Ethan and I had spent a lot of time authoring some content on cybersecurity mesh architecture, trying to explain how it kind of relates to the enterprise itself too. And part of that includes a maturity model. I'm gonna let Ethan kind of take that on the content level, but more importantly, we want to provide some real life scenarios that we've seen ourselves in with our customers and how we're trying to resolve some of these long-standing challenges in security. So we're going to go into use cases and hopefully we get pretty technical about it. And then, of course, you know, uniquely enough, as solutions provider, we're unique in this space because pretty much the only one that's actually encompassing the entirety of the enterprise. So we're also going to showcase technically how we support these different use cases we cover, and then we can leave some time for Q&A. So Ethan, you're further ahead on this research than I am. What can you tell me about cybersecurity mesh and everyone else there for that matter? What is it?
Sure. So, cybersecurity mesh architecture or cybersecurity mesh, really, when you think about it more in practice, was coined by Gartner. They've talked a lot about how this is an up and coming trend. It was an up and coming trend for 2022. And now, of course, in December, everyone, whether it's vendors, industry analysts, or I guess the social media influencers that be on LinkedIn when it comes to cybersecurity, are all talking about the top trends of 2023. And of cybersecurity mesh is one of the top trends that Gartner listed as going into 2023. I authored a 12-page white paper that you can find. Actually, I think if you Google cybersecurity mesh white paper, we're the top Google search result for that on cybersecurity mesh. There's a topic I'm passionate about, and what it is really a new approach to combining all of your different data together in cybersecurity from different silos into a cooperative ecosystem using a composable and scalable approach, right? And so it's not while we accelerate the adoption of cybersecurity mesh through our product, philosophically, if you back up, it's not a specific product. It's a philosophical approach or an architectural approach to solving specific problems that we see in cyber, but it also has a positive effect on other stakeholders outside of just InfoSec, across networking, applications, accelerating digital transformation through leveraging data that's been aggregated and contextualized.
I think that's really nice that it's a framework because it means you can kind of pick and choose to kind of solve the challenges of the enterprise, right? So we'll
Yep.
talk about a few of them today, but what's most important to know is that everyone's in different places on maturity and adoption level. So actually, why don't we jump into probably what the primary point of concern for most enterprises is, which is the cyber asset challenge,
Yeah.
right? We need to understand what these things are. And I think historically this has been the CASM products, the cyber
Yeah.
asset attack surface management, double A in the acronym, but CASM for those of us that want the shorthand notations. Um, Ethan, I think you've spent plenty of time not only managing cyber asset inventories in-house at McDonald's and elsewhere, but also with their customers. How are they approaching the cyber asset challenge? And then where do we see the overlap with CSMA? Where do they
Yeah.
interplay, and where do they diverge?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of misnomers around cybersecurity mesh and chasm. I think they're very closely related. Both in practice really encompass data aggregation because neither is an endpoint security solution, neither is a network security solution, neither is a cloud security posture management specific solution. They are both about, or neither are scanners, right? So both methodologies are data being aggregated to produce specific outputs, insights, and automation. And we'll get into the maturity model of cybersecurity mesh later, but I would say cybersecurity mesh actually encompasses and really subsumes chasm. Both are Gartner coined frames. Chasm is aimed specifically at the asset, right? So do you understand how many devices you have on your network? Do you understand what your different security tools say in a single pane of glass about those? Do you understand what SaaS applications or applications you have running internally? Those are all good chasm, really asset management questions to ask. Where cybersecurity mesh really subsumes that is cybersecurity mesh takes proper asset management and hygiene as a good baseline, but then builds on top of it with things like SIM and security data lakes, taking in telemetry for showing you not just what you have, but what's always question number two after you understand what you have is how are those things connected, whether it's devices or users, networking devices and endpoints. And then you build on that with other risk silos, whether it be vulnerability management silos, pulling specific from CI/CD or code developer-driven tools that are security-driven or just development-driven. And then really cybersecurity mesh's ultimate goal, at least how we view it from a appNovi perspective and really for the industry as a whole, is not just driving more information to the analyst and putting data at their fingertips, which is important, but also contextually driving automation, right? So that's really the final mile is context-driven machine automation.
And context is everything. I always give the anecdote when I was working within pen testing engagements, right? In some ways, I had an advantage over my adversaries, right? The defenders, because I had to abide by network security controls, right? Defensive security teams see everything that could be wrong in the network, and I only saw the things that were contextually available to me. So my prioritization list was actually really good, right? I could focus on those medium level vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, everyone else is running around patching the critical and highs, and a new cycle comes around. And then those of us that are able to conduct effective reconnaissance are able to, in this case, we were hired. We weren't doing damage, but we were able to be successful in our engagements. And I think a big part of this is because we have very common challenges across enterprise security. First and foremost, right, the network is more complex. It's not just the cloud problem. It's the fact that there are now multiple networks out there. There's SDN, there's public cloud, there's hard metal servers, right? These things all exist. You can't pretend that they don't. They comprise the network. But because of these different types of technologies, we now have different tools to monitor each environment and maybe different teams. So that has definitely obscured assets intelligence themselves, right? One, what is this asset? What is this IP? What is this data point I'm getting from vendor A versus B? And where do they actually match? So that has totally obscured our asset inventory. Meanwhile, as we implement more tools to monitor these environments, regain visibility, we're now being used across different teams, right? So now we have a lot of different types of data sources, which are actually kind of doing the same thing, but different, right? That we now need to query across. And that is increasingly more problematic because now we have more alerts than ever before because we bought all these great tools to alert us, right? Everyone loves more alerts. And our teams are not stagnating, but it is hard to staff up and skill up people. So every enterprise seems to be dealing with the same challenges, and it's the outcomes of the implementation and adoption of digital transformation. And I think that the crux of it, cybersecurity mesh architecture really seeks to resolve a lot of these challenges that exist today, because as we've had investments in disparate systems and training up different teams to like manage security in specific environments, things have become fragmented. And the reality is the enterprise is everything, not just one thing. And a response might cross all these different networks, right? And perhaps other teams and stakeholders. So why don't we actually take a look at how data flows to an analyst? And I was always the attacker. You were the defender, Ethan. So I'm going to let you kind of narrate.
Blue team, red team. So this is the purple webinar, right?
Yeah. So what does it look like for you on the data flow, right? Today, most enterprises are dealing with their monitoring and alerting solutions in a pretty similar process with very similar outcomes. So I'll let you go through it.
Yeah. So when you think about what's coming to the SOC analyst, again, what you talked about, we have limited teams. We have a more complex networks from OT to private cloud to legacy data centers, public cloud. And then you have all the encompassing security controls across all those things, right? So there's tons of data there's some of that data, primarily event-driven, tends to be driven into something like a SIEM or a security data lake that's doing analysis. You get an alert, and then it ends up ultimately with the SOC analyst. And what ultimately is happening there is, because none of those things are really communicative together, right? It's not like, even if you dump everything to a SIEM, your EDR solution and your firewall might not actually have meaningful contextual data shared together. Even if it goes to the SIEM, often SIEMs, even the next gen ones, are often missing a lot of asset context from each of those things. There's still 10, 12, however many single panes of glass that we've created. You got an XDR solution, an EDR solution, an NDR solution, right? All the DRs that you have to log into, check out the vuln management, right? Then you have to go back into the CMDB and understand who is this person, who is this IP that we have an alert on. And so the data is just really one way, right? It's not contextual. There's still a lot of metadata missing. And when it's presented to the analyst, it's presented in rows and rows and rows of data in something like a Splunk or a QRadar, right? And so without context and without all of that data being properly aggregated and presented in a singular way, it leads to data being missed, long response times, miss SLAs because you have to go and spend time logging into other consoles. Like you said, it's not even that tools are siloed as much as even not only are tools siloed, but also teams are siloed. So even in security, you have the EDR guys, if it's a large enough enterprise, you have the endpoint guys, you have the network security guys, and you have the vuln management guys, and the threat hunting guys. And even within security and risk, right? There's still data silos in communication barriers where maybe incident response is saying, come on, vuln team, I need more of your data to make a good decision. So it's this one way, not a mesh, certainly. It's just an aggregated event store into a SIEM, an alert, and then a chasing of the rabbit, as it were, down the rabbit hole to get to a place where you can make a high fidelity decision.
And ultimately, this
this
response or this reaction to this is costly, right? It is a challenge for analysts on the day-to-day basis, right? Because most of them don't want to be Excel masters, right? They could have gotten a job in finance too. The reality is they want to be able to make security decisions based upon their domain expertise and reduce risk, right? This is the rewarding aspects of the business. But as we see, like on the enterprise level, or at least how it's impacting them, right? We have increases in operational costs, right? If we need to throw more tooling and more people to it. If we have any ability to actually like consume our data and have meaningful interpretations of it, reporting on it, we have incompleteness of attack surface mapping, right? That means we have gaps. There are ways in that we are not aware of, right? Or might be relying on other people to detect and remediate. I think it also means that when we have to make changes in a security response, the most important thing we can have is a level of assurance that we're not going to break anything, right? like rule number one in security, Ethan, in my mind, don't break anything, right? We got to enable the business. It's not about filing
True.
decryption photons, right? We got to make things work and work better.
Yep.
And then
which no, which is a true thing, and the unfortunate part I think about security and is that it is, well, the fortunate part is that it's supposed to enable the business to run smoothly, move forward with the least amount of risk as possible. But again, because of and you're talking about it, because our tools, security tooling, isn't sharing data with each other, we don't mesh in and have a lot of, up until today, have good context from application teams and their data. There's always that communication barrier, kind of that rough developer and security persona. Development's trying to move fast, security's trying to move securely and just slow down a little bit. There's communication barriers, there's data silo barriers, networking data isn't meshed in. And so because of that lack of a centralized data plane where you can mesh in together all those different things, there ends up being a lot of errors in security, even outside of an incident where there's a firewall change that breaks application connectivity. There's an endpoint agent that is deployed to an asset that belongs to an application that's legacy and shouldn't have that agent, right? Because it's not fully supported and it brings downtime. And again, I know we're still in this part of the presentation talking about the problems, but these are firsthand things that I've dealt with that really necessitate this need for cybersecurity mesh, right? This is the ouch, it hurts doctor, it hurts right here. That's really leading to the prognosis, right? This is the diagnosis, the prognosis that we need to move forward with cybersecurity mesh architecture as a framework.
Yeah, because the hurt's real and it's not getting better for most organizations. So if we kind of think past, I guess, how we measure the impact of these problems, we should be talking more about probably what the actual outcomes are of cybersecurity mesh architecture and its implementation. So we've talked a lot about the outcomes of not having effective data management and accessibility and meshing and that actual central plane. What happens when that does exist?
Yeah, so we've now departed impact and the hurt, right? And so the positives or the side effects of the medicine that we're talking about, which is cybersecurity mesh. And cybersecurity mesh is really about not just aggregating things into a SIM. It's not the same approach that we've had for forever, because we've always ended up talking about like, oh, I have a SIM, right? I have all the data there. But then the accessibility of the data is hard. It misses that metadata. And so meshing is about creating a central data plane of all the different sources of truth. IT infrastructure and service management, pulling data from the CMDB, working with security data, both at a network level, from the firewall, from switches, from VPC flow logs, NSG flow logs, if you're looking at the cloud, bringing data in from email data lakes, from EDR and vuln management, bringing in identity planes, right? All those different sources of data, leveraging the SIM in a new and enriched way, right? Where that data is more accessible, more enriched, more brought to, more meaningful by bringing it together. And by doing that, once you get the data in one place, it's not about making another data lake with storing all those things raw. It's about grabbing the specific data points that we can deduplicate, build a repository of assets, build a repository of, and those assets, by the way, are users, devices, servers, clients, network endpoints, infrastructure things, VPCs to interfaces, to IP addresses, to code repositories, all those things brought together and normalized that you can query, dig through that in a repeated way. Understand the interoperability of all those different data points. How is a user who's a contractor logging into a server that's crown jewel, right? That has a network dependency on a development application, right? How do all those interrelations and connections of data matter? Only in cybersecurity mesh can you get those different insights, get what we call cross-domain intelligence, where you're not just looking at risk from the perspective of this thing is vulnerable, you can now understand this thing is vulnerable and exposed to the internet and has an internal, it's an internal crown jewel application with PII data, and it hasn't been patched and is missing my EDR agent, right? So you can really daisy chain all those different components to make the highest fidelity decision about prioritization or incident response. So humans are making high fidelity decisions. You can drive that context into automation as well.
I think that's a really good point, because that contextual piece, I think, is what everyone always wanted from their SIM and never really got.
Yeah.
Because that was holding all of the data, and you could configure alerts based upon thresholds and a lot of other things. But the reality is if everything's tuned to severity or third-party detected activity from a vendor or something like that, the reality is all of this stuff actually lacks the context that you, the security team, the IT teams, actually understand about the inner workings of your environment, right?
Yeah.
Things can't be detected in a vacuum and effectively assessed. So,
Yep.
and I'm looking at the pretty picture, and I like all the angles, and I think everyone probably has a better understanding of why this makes sense. Why don't we talk about how it actually gets done? And I'm going to turn it to you because you built it, and you should walk through the logic, because this is something that obviously we built, and other people could feel free to rip off. Obviously, it's going to take a lot of time and money, but why don't you walk us through the logic on this?
Sure. So really, when you think about cybersecurity mesh, and I will say that Gartner has their own iconography and graphs about how they think about cybersecurity mesh architecture. It's quite large. It's a little bit, it's just a lot to take in, right? No hate or shame to the designers who made that from a graphical perspective. But given that at appNovi we're really implementing cybersecurity mesh in the field, we wanted to simplify this down so that people could really understand in practice what it looks like. And so really at the baseline, you have all the things that you as security teams are trying to protect. You're trying to protect your users, you're trying to protect internal customers, external customers to the business, your networks, the infrastructure that's running, your compute, servers, trying to protect the cloud, data, intellectual property, PII, all the different key components. And then on top of those things, you have solutions that monitor those. This could be a SolarWinds, this could be network monitoring, application monitoring, this could be, anything that you can really think of, an APM. And then on top of that, you also have the tools that are meant to protect that. You have your firewalls at the network level. You have an endpoints, agents that are sitting out there trying to protect individual agents. You have, UEBA solutions out there. And what appNovi, when we think about cybersecurity mesh, it's about plugging in with all of those different things via API mechanisms or however you can go and get that data and converging all of those together. And it really starts from a list perspective of building a dynamic inventory of repository of all that you have, of all your assets, from devices, whether clients, servers, cloud, OT, physical environments, right? Could be physical things down to USB drives or anything like that, to firewalls, network endpoints, applications, software running, code repositories that are out there. Building that list just by using the data you already have, and then plugging into those same solutions, not just to build a list, but turn it into a graph model by taking a look at the telemetry. How are all those things connected? How does an employee own an email that has a user account that's logging into a machine that has strange network activity to applications hosting or storing key intellectual property to an organization, right? How can you use that connections, once it's normalized, to do really two things? One is analysis of those connections, looking for specific risks, looking at flaws in the network. It could be from a resiliency perspective. How is an application that isn't built, doesn't have proper good secure design? Are there assets that are seen by my vuln scanner that don't have my EDR agent? So doing that analysis of those things, and then using all of that context from all the different sources, not just security, to make enriched decisions to automate with good context, right? 'Cause how many times have people implemented a SOAR only to hit business roadblocks because there was missing context or couldn't quite make the decision because we had to go contact a person or reach someone out for a piece of data? Cybersecurity Mesh really answers that final gap in automation by having all those data points, not just at an analyst or a person's fingertips, but also driving really enriched zero-touch automation into your orchestration systems as well. So building on top of all those things, from what you're trying to protect to what you have deployed, building an inventory of what you have, connecting the dots between the context, how are those things connected and reliant on each other, normalizing that data so that we can do good analysis and then make good decisions and outcomes, whether it's a human or a machine that's making those decisions.
I think what's really valuable in all of this too is that we're not necessarily talking about replacing a bunch of this stuff. It's really more of a matter of being more effective in utilizing it, because everyone already has a security tech stack and IT tech stack that they have to buy, right? You pretty much have to buy a firewall. I could see an argument like maybe one firewall and a ton of routers, but like, everyone has to buy this stuff to ensure operational continuity in their environments. But
and the key thing on that, right, is it's not that we're trying to replace, but that you can do so much more with less with cybersecurity mesh, particularly if you take a look at that normalization layer. Because we're doing consistent analysis, is something covered by an endpoint security agent, right? So if you're using one endpoint security agent and a competitor comes in with a better, faster, stronger, cheaper option, traditionally to do that migration is a massive amounts of resources, because even gathering the data of where are those assets, who owns them, is that person still here? Did we look at the CMDB and are we missing an asset, right? It's this whole process. Because cybersecurity mesh has normalized all your different assets, what sources and silos see those specific data, you're less reliant on a specific vendor. You're not locked in. And that interoperability of being able to roll out new solutions, approach digital transformation differently, a transition between vendors. There's so much freedom and cost savings that come with just having that good normalization of your environment.
Ethan, I want to quickly touch upon obviously how we do this because we do actually have a pretty attractive solution for this. We've talked a lot about the kind of convergence of data, and that is primarily oriented around solving the asset visibility and discovery challenge, right? So the whole premise of cybersecurity mesh architecture, especially in consideration of appNovi, is that we actually need to integrate with all of these sources to actually provide that mesh, right? Because it's not just about finding everything. That is the first step, right? In security, you can only secure that which you can see, right? So if we start with a layer of visibility that is, total across the entire enterprise, we normalize the data across all these different data sources in a way that, one vulnerability from Tenable is the same as Rapid7 because it's the CVE, right? We're actually able to provide the appropriate intelligence and represent it in a way that can be easily retrieved, right? And when we marry this with everything else, that's when we start to gain the context, right? And that within itself, I think, sets so many enterprises up for a world of success. It's beyond just like the asset inventory challenge, right? Because Chasm can support that, but it's more so what do you do with that information, right? There are steps beyond it, and I'll let you talk about the benefits here because I think you've been on the front lines of implementing it with customers and measuring it, firsthand.
Certainly. So and if you think about the maturity model, right, for cybersecurity mesh, the baseline is we want to look at asset management, right? And again, cybersecurity mesh is all about finding the balance between doing analysis and responding and reducing to risk and security incidents, right? So you can do a bunch of analysis and get great prioritization and take so little action that, you make really high fidelity decisions on analysis, but there's always new CVEs, there's new risks, right? So you could do quality, but then you miss quantity, or you can do a bunch of quantity, right? I remember back to the McDonald's days, there was a specific stakeholder who said, well, why don't we just go look at all these lows, CVEs, right? Like forget the highs and the criticals. We have so many lows. Why don't we just go knock out all the lows or the mediums? And it's like, yeah, that's that would certainly reduce a lot, right? If we focused on that quantity game, but then you're making very low quality decisions on that. So in cybersecurity mesh, you have to start with asset management. You have to understand how assets are connected. Then understanding and contextualizing risk with business data, vuln data, all those other things. And then lastly, as that's a baseline that's built up, you got to go and contextually drive automation, orchestration, and decision making. And so the core layer is, as I move forward, and I apologize, I just wanted to walk through that maturity model. The first step is asset management, right? So this is where you start with ingesting data from things that protect and things that monitor. You could say things that host or run the business as well, those different things. And once you converge that, not just looking at specific environments, it's not just about cloud, right? It's about understanding everything from OT to data centers to cloud. You really solve core information security control 1 and 2 of building that good asset inventory. As you look at normalized data sources, right, all across everything and do that deduplication, you'll identify very quickly where things like CMDBs are incorrect, not dynamic, incomplete, or flawed. And then you can start to do validation of key things for security, like, is my EDR agent really deployed everywhere? Once I've discovered my assets and I'm looking at, say, CrowdStrike or a SentinelOne or another solution out there, like a Trend Micro, you can also then make a decision of, does everything have my EDR agent? Is everything being scanned, right? Do I have the proper security controls deployed everywhere? And that's really the baseline or the first step in implementing cybersecurity mesh. I think some people are doing parts of this today with some of the chasm solutions that are out there. I think some of them are incomplete because they miss things like the network data and other things, SIM data. A lot of things are missed. And certainly as the second step is unique to cybersecurity mesh. But chasm's a good start. We personally at appNovi have really built the chasm piece of the maturity model into our solution as a whole.
And so when we talk about the actual like assets themselves, you've described them, right? What's missing, EDR agents and stuff like that. That is like the momentum to have a fully visible and probably maintained attack surface, right? We have the ability to have some sort of autonomous automation on top. This is not included in my vulnerability scanner. I want to include it in the next scan, right? Or it's missing an agent. We need to involve the orchestrator or whatever the vendors provided, right? Whatever the XDR capacity is. But I think what's most interesting, at least to me, beyond the kind of asset information or attribution piece, is the connections, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be network connections, but like if we know what the asset is on a technical level, how do we establish like the context to the business?
Yeah. So I'll expand on that even more. So it's network data, but it's anything that connects assets together. And again, assets are users, assets are identity, our identity plane, it's the network plane, it's how does a user interact with a system, how does a user own and interact with systems like GitHub or anything out there. And so the second piece in the maturity model that's really important in mapping your attack surface is asset connection analysis. So how do devices communicate on your network? How do they relate to applications? How do applications inter and intra depend on each other, right? So it's really about understanding all of those different dependencies, and then you can use those dependencies to really drive digital transformation. Once you understand your assets, how they're connected in a traditional data center, you can start to offload things to the cloud. Once you understand how an application that was born and running in the cloud is interdependent and running on it, interdependent on itself, interdependent on other applications, you then have application mobility. You can move it from AWS to Azure, to GCP, to Oracle Cloud, because you have that comprehension of not just your assets, but how they're interrelated to each other. You can make better attack surface and risk decisions because you can understand if this user is compromised, here's all the access they have in the environment and how expansive it is and the different types of data that they'll have access to. And you can drive that data. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I appreciate the narrative, and I understand all of the context that we get to see in some of the attributions to things we might not get from like a CMD, for example. But you're getting into some, I think, really valuable information that especially security analysts would take an interest in, which is the actual risk overlay. And it's not just the infrastructure and the people, it's not just the network connections or relationships, but the actual application of security and vulnerability and event data. And all of a sudden, all of these things that have mapped out this enterprise estate now become a little bit more interactive and more easily interpreted to our friends in the SOC. And so what are the actual like outcomes there?
Yeah. So when you have that comprehension, like you said, there's proactive vuln risk mitigation decisions that can be made. But then you can really start to modernize and change the SOC with that context, because the security operations, even if you just take the asset management problem, security operations, when they have an alert on an IP address, if they have an alert on a host name, they have to then go into so many silos and panes of glass just to understand what is that asset. And once you add that connectivity analysis in, you can visualize SIM data, you can take all of its connection data out, you can take it from the network, NDR solutions, firewalls, you name it. Once you make that connection of that asset data very accessible, the SOC can really shorten MTTR. Analysts as humans can make high quality decisions about, if I take this specific asset offline, it belongs to this application, it could cause this specific downtime, which would be worse than actually the loss if I don't mitigate it, right? So you can drive really high fidelity decision making from a human, and then you can also drive that into SOC's automation tooling, right? The SOAR isn't just look an alert, external threat feed for enrichment. It's internal enrichment and understanding that business context of things to go and make that automation decision.
And I think that part of the benefits there, not just the automation, right? The ability to resolve things without getting analysts engaged and also presenting information to the analysts. But if we have data sets that are presented in a meaningful way, but abstracted enough that it doesn't really require you or me to look at it, but we could actually show it to a non-technical stakeholder and understand it.
Yep.
That all of a sudden is kind of a game changer in the incident response process, right?
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, to have that context.
For me anyway, the benefit is the way I always frame it is like, I've been married to my wife for like 15 years, and she has heard everything I've done professionally in that time and understood none of it. But she is a stakeholder. But if I graph out our home network and everything else like that and show her where risks lay, all of a sudden it's kind of like, oh, I thought you were just talking mumbo jumbo, which is primarily what I have been doing for a very long time. But it is an appropriate metaphor, because what we are articulating here is not just the convergence of data and the ability to represent it in a way and also provide analysis across it, but also present it to people that need to consume it to make decisions or direct resources to have an effective response. And I don't know, from your time in the SOC and incident response, I mean, was that always fluid before, or like I felt like there were always hookups before. I mean, I've been cursed out by CIOs before on findings,
Yeah. So I like what you're getting at with the contextualized risk, which is naturally what we're talking about. And I remember when I was in the security operations, even to a SOC analyst, you would get a specific alert, right? And you're like, I just don't know what this means. I just don't, like, what is this asset? What is this IP address? Like, should this be happening? Like, is this really an anomaly? like what's really going on? And so when you lack all of that right context, and you can't even visualize it in a way to help you understand the impact, right? There's a huge loss of investment, not even just in humans and human capital, but also tool capital. And so, yeah, we lacked, there's often a lack, particularly without mesh, of just relevance and context of risk and impact. And so once you're able to ingest that data, normalize it, and analyze it, that presentation layer is huge, right? Mapping, like to your wife, you can you could try explaining cyber risk, but once you show a visualization and contextualize the risk for her of this is your personal impact of cyber risk in our house, right? It changes really the message and the effectiveness of the data and the humans that are spending time analyzing it.
The picture's worth 10,000 rows, right?
Yeah, pictures worth 1,000 rows, 10,000, 100,000, sometimes a millions others. So it's definitely.
I think we've been talking about what this looks like and how it presents. Ethan, maybe I can ask you to do a quick demo.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's dive in. So again, let's get into a few kind of practical use cases around cybersecurity mesh, some implementations of it. And again, the first phase is, or even before we get into the first phase of the maturity model, it's important to note that cybersecurity mesh is not really about introducing new agents, new scanners, anything like that. It's about meshing together all the sources that already exist, from what IT operations is using to security, vulnerability management, security operations, threat hunting, all the application teams, networking teams. And what appNovi does is we really enable this base framework or this base data plane by allowing you to bring off the shelf solutions into appNovi just by entering your API credentials. We also provide more advanced ways to ingest data from anywhere using our in-product IDE, our SDK to identify assets and their connections. Because often in large enterprises, there's key sources of data from each team that's not in off-the-shelf databases. Maybe it's internal tooling or a database that's been maintained over time by one of your internal teams. And so the first phase after as you get started in the cybersecurity mesh maturity model is asset management. And so appNovi builds a repository of all your different assets. And assets can be non-traditional. It can be servers, it can be clients, it can be specific cloud components such as VPCs, it could be user accounts, software. All these different things are viewed by appNovi as specific assets. Could be network endpoints as well, maybe a switch. I'll throw that in there. What we do is we normalize, and it's important that if you're taking your first step in the journey of cybersecurity mesh, you have a mechanism that can normalize and deduplicate all these different sources of assets and understand, right, what each data lake is saying about all of those different assets. That plays into, and we'll show you some examples, some other things like security control validation. Is everything being scanned? Does everything have the required security agent? But another key component in cybersecurity mesh, the second phase, is not just understanding assets, but understanding asset connectivity, right? So what we've done here is we've integrated with something like a Splunk, Azure Sentinel, could be Snowflake as a security data lake as well, where you can come in here and understand connectivity of things. So here's a user logging into this VM we've expanded. We could further expand and see all the other devices that they're logging into. We can see that this user account is owned by this employee that's not listed as the owners of these VMs, and yet the user account is logging into them, right? So you can start to see it more than just assets. It's about understanding and analyzing how assets are ultimately connected. And so as we go a little bit deeper into the third phase, what that allows us to do is really understand contextually risk, right? By understanding the assets and how they're connected, I could say things like, I want to understand maybe what are my servers that are not seen by SentinelOne, right? And normally this is an out-of-the-box finding, so we could come in here and we could say, show me some of these rules, such as devices that are not seen by SentinelOne, and we can see there's some out-of-the-box analytics here. But we could further use those connection data to enrich this and say, I also want to know which of these have an active security event on it, and I've narrowed that list down. We could even say, hey, maybe it's not just that, it's also which of these actually belong to an internal application. And so as we're doing this, we can start to really equip the humans that are making all of these decisions on a day-to-day basis. So security operations, risk teams, help equip networking with the right dependency mapping of applications and assets. But again, it goes beyond that third phase of giving contextual risk analysis, and it goes also into enabling contextual automation, right? Removing humans from the equation in some cases, where we can make high fidelity decisions, not be blocked by often automation in the context of SOAR or other things get blocked because there's that missing gap of context and understanding of the business, who to contact, all right, missing different context around if something might be broken if you scan it, right? So in this case, what we can do is we could say, show me any server not scanned by Rapid7. Tell me also if it belongs to maybe an application or specific criticality of an application. Tell me also if these things maybe are connected to the internet or have an active security event. I can see that here. And then this allows us to enable automation. So appNovi can plug in with SOAR platforms, or we have our own automation and orchestration that we can do. In this case, because it recognizes that I'm looking for devices missing Rapid7, either an agent or not being scanned by it, this can go and take automated action to go ship these assets over to Rapid7 for scanning or for an agent as well. So again, those are some practical examples of appNovi really implementing those cybersecurity mesh maturity phases, right? And some of those use cases associated with them. So Dan, why don't we go back to you?
Awesome. So Ethan, as you said, anyone could go to appnovi.com today, sign up for a trial. No one has to pay anything. They'll get a login to appNovi. You can start integrating all of your data sources. How long does it take? What's the implementation?
So it's a matter of minutes. Once we get up and running, it's just about connecting your API keys to each of the solutions. We click run. It takes a few minutes to just gather the data from each of the solutions, and you'll be off and running in 5 to 10 minutes with insights.
Awesome. So for any of those of you in attendance today that saw what you did, liked it, are getting coached in by your bosses, or maybe you yourself are exploring it, you can start with Cybersecurity Mesh Architecture onboarding today without paying anything to assess whether or not it's helpful. So Ethan, thank you very much for your time, your insights, your anecdotes, and I'd say general charm as well. And I appreciate everyone's attention and time today. Thank everyone so much.
Thank you, guys. Cheers.